Okay, so this week we're starting to look at the actual interventions that work when instructing kids with ASD, and the logical place to start with that is the idea of discrete trial training, as that's the one that's the best researched, or the most widely researched, I should say. That's not to say necessarily that it's the best intervention, but there is the most research about discrete trial training. So as a teaching paradigm, this is chapter 9 from your Lucely text. Discrete trial is teaching in discrete trial therapy is a term that really tends to scare teachers, and it is a very scientific and highly structured process, and it involves a lot of data collection and doing things correctly. But in a nutshell, all it really is good old-fashioned teaching. You ask a kid to do something, they do it, and you reinforce it. You see in your additional readings this week, we have it broken down into something called the 3 R's. Again, that's a start material from Amy Matthews, and we talk about 3 R's. We request something, we ask them to do something, we reinforce it, or we prompt them. We request something, they complete the behavior, or either they complete the behavior or they're prompted through it, and there's also a handout in there about the prompt hierarchy, and then you reinforce that behavior. Discrete trial, all it really is breaking down the complex steps of a bigger skill into several smaller skills, and then teaching those sub-skills repeatedly through drill work and practice. And this started, if you see in your text, from some training that was originally done on animals. The idea of discrete trial teaching was originally done. You are familiar, of course, with the Pavlov dog study. Our reading talks about the puzzle box and the cats and so forth, and we've done quite a bit of research there. It started with quite a bit of research about how to train animals, and if you've ever done any discrete trial training and you've ever done any dog training, you'd see that there are considerable similarities to that. It comes down to the idea of the law of effect, and that is what happens as a result of behavior shapes that behavior and whether that behavior will occur again. If something felt good when you did it, you're going to do it again. If something felt bad when you did it, you're more likely to avoid doing that again. So the consequence of the behavior reinforces or causes the behavior to recur. So as I said, it was initially designed with animals, but then we learned and started using it on children in the early 50s, and actually the first widely acknowledged study was done by Wolf, Risley, and Mies, and that was where they taught some vocal verbal behavior to a young child with autism, and they found that it was incredibly effective, and it started to take off from there. The idea of discrete trial therapy in use with kids with autism really became more widely popularized through the knowledge of the work of Ivar Lovaas, and he did some very big studies in California in the 60s. And I think the most widely known one that he did was, I'm trying to remember the specifics off the top of my head, but I think he had something like, I don't remember the number of students, but about half of the students that he did the intervention on, 40 hours a week of intensive discrete trial teaching, actually you weren't able to pick them out of a crowd after the intervention. They became normalized. And that study itself has since been criticized because of some of the ways that the study itself was set up, that it was probably not normed correctly. But you can't really argue or deny some of the points of the study, in that ABA, or discrete trial therapy in particular, does teach specific skills in kids with autism. So our text nicely lays out for you the 5 components of a discrete trial, the 5 little pieces of things that you have to do. And I'm going to go through these, but first I also want to refer you back to your additional reading where I've put that simplified version and called the 3 R's, and that breaks it down to 3 points. And that I think I'll refer to back next week more when we talk about naturalistic teaching strategies. But that one, if you think about it this way, the 3 R's is you request, you ask them to do something, they respond or you prompt them through it, and you reinforce. That breaks it down a little bit more basically, but here are the 5 parts of a traditional discrete trial. The antecedent, sometimes called the SD in scientific terms, and I think that's stimulus derivative if I'm not mistaking that. The antecedent is where you have an expectation that they're going to do something, or you've prompted them to do something, or you've requested them to do something. And then the next step is prompting them through doing it. See the additional reading I've actually given you a document that kind of describes those several different prompt steps in the prompt hierarchy, and you prompt them through doing what you've asked them to do, eventually fading that prompt back until they're doing it independently. They give you the response, the desired behavior happens, and then what was the consequence of that response? They did it correctly, then they are reinforced. They did it incorrectly, then they're corrected. Or in traditional discrete trial therapy, they may even have an aversive consequence. So if they did something wrong or bad, there might be an aversive. There are some types of discrete trial therapy in which they're still using that. You might have heard about the boy who his mother taught him to communicate. He wore a rubber band on his wrist and they would snap the rubber band. I've heard of people using hot sauce with kids, or just a firm, sharp no as a consequence when they do something wrong. We tend to use errorless teaching in the schools, which really refers to you go back and prompt them and don't let them make the mistake. And increase the prompting hierarchy as opposed to using an aversive. So the idea here is like the idea of the law of effect is that the consequence, whatever you do in response to the behavior that they showed you, is going to shape that ongoing behavior. You can either extinguish it or you can encourage the appropriate behavior with the consequence that you use. And then the final step is the intertrial interval. What's happening before the next trial? What's the next step of the next trial? And so on and so forth. Your pacing is a key piece with that. One of the key mistakes that people have a tendency to make when they're doing traditional discrete trial therapy is messing up the intertrial interval. And what I've seen happen quite a bit is people aren't ready with the next question or with the next antecedent or SD. They have to turn and find materials, or they have to find reinforcers, or they're taking their data in between, and so the pacing kind of gets mixed up there, and you lose the momentum and you lose the motivation of the child on an intertrial interval. That's just the space between the first time you asked and the next time you ask. So as I've said, ABA is basically what I like to think of as just good teaching. You ask them to do something, they do it, you reinforce it, and that's what you do all day in teaching. What makes it really different from other strategies, what makes discrete trial therapy very different, is the intense amount of structure. It's typically done at a table, one-on-one, one teacher, one student, specific materials, very small steps, very specific skills. You have a specific curriculum, and I think I'll put an example of a discrete trial curriculum in your extra reading folder so you can get an idea of that. There are earlier steps taught before later steps. So for example, before we can teach a child to follow directions, we have to teach them imitative behavior. So we teach a very beginning, basic imitation of gross motor steps, such as clap your hands, touch your nose. And you don't say clap your hands, touch your nose. You would say do this, and you show them that. And then once you've trained that step, you might train the verbal command of clap your hands, touch your nose, and so on and so forth. And then you might have more complex directions, such as clap your hands, then touch your nose. And then it kind of builds up from there. So the primary difference with discrete trial teaching is the structure, the steps, and the intensity and frequency of the drill. You're repeating it over and over and over. You're drill practicing these minimal steps until they master each step, and then you move on to the next step and do it collectively. There's some really cool advantages to using discrete trial therapy, and some things about it that make it easy. One of those things is that you can get a huge number of learning opportunities because you're asking, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. And we're all familiar with the benefits of drill practice. If you've ever studied for a spelling test or a math test where you have to just rote learn something, multiplication facts, for example, you just know that practicing over and over and over really gets that rote learning down. So that really is an advantage. You have a lot more learning opportunities, a lot more ability to practice a specific skill. So you can imagine if you've got a kid and you're trying to get him to learn the expectation to respond to the question, let's say, what's your name? And you have that child in a circle time group setting, and the teacher comes in and she says, hi, what's your name, to that kid, and then she goes to the next kid and said, and what's your name, and goes to the next kid, goes through 7 kids asking the question, what's your name, and then moves on to what day is today, and how is it cloudy out today, during, say, a calendar type of activity. So you ask yourself, how many times did the child get to practice the skill, answer the question, what's your name? That child had one opportunity to be prompted through that. Granted, it's in a natural context. In a discrete trial context, you would ask that child, what's your name? Bobby. What's your name? Bobby. What's your name? Pause with the prompt. He says, Bobby, yay, your name is Bobby, and he gets reinforced. That child will have at least 10 opportunities in however long it takes you to ask that question to answer the question, what's your name? So it's practice, practice, practice. So that number of high trials when you're trying to teach a skill initially, huge benefit to that. Another really big benefit is the fact that it's really super easy to train. There are multiple texts out there on the market. I have two of them that I use all the time. One's called A Work in Progress, and the other is a book by Catherine Maurice. Is it? I don't have it in front of me. Is it the Me book? Where they actually have they have the actual curriculum laid out in the books. Then they actually have the lessons laid out down to the script of what the trainer has to say. I can hand that book to a parapro or a parent, and they can run that trial all day long. It's a really easy format for people to use. And so there's a lot of benefit to it that way. The other thing is, the data collection piece is simple. I said, say, what's your name? You said it, it's a plus. You needed a prompt, it's a P. I had to give you a verbal imitation, and maybe it says M for model, and it's really spelled out on a grid sheet that you can easily design. It's very simple to take that data when that's all you're doing. Plus, 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 minus, plus. Some of the disadvantages are that if that's all you're doing and all you're training is discrete trial therapy, it doesn't generalize very well. You get kids who are very robotic and very rote. So if you are, let's say, keep going with the example of the what's your name drill, you say, what's your name? And he says, Bobby. A lot of times what will happen is that you're walking down the hall and somebody will say, hey, little guy, what's your name? He won't respond. He's going to respond to the person who says, what's your name? In that sing-songy tone at the table where he knows he's going to get the Skittle next. But in the hallway, when somebody says it a little bit differently, it's not so much the same. The other thing is that they tend to get kind of rote or ritualized in their responses. So if you say, what's your name? And he typically responds, and by the way, he's going to respond however it was modeled for him. He'll say it just like you said it. Bobby. He won't say things like, my name's Robert, or my name's Bob, or he won't say it in a different way. It'll just be very rote and ritualized the way that he learned it. That's how he'll say it. And again, it won't be in context. And it's really difficult once you've learned that skill. If you don't program for generalization, it's difficult to translate that to the natural environment. So how do you take that what's your name skill and put it at circle time or in the hallway time for other people to learn? And why is it important for a kid to know his name? Well, a police officer finds this kid. He's walked out of his house. He's walking down the street, and he's lost. And a police officer might say to him, "Hey, kid, what's your name?" If that's not generalized, you can see that there's absolutely no functionality to the skill. So it's difficult to move that to the natural environment unless you program for generalization to begin with. And I think another one of the handouts I give you is some common mistakes that people make with when they're doing discrete trial training. If you're going to train the question, what's your name, you need to be training it in the hallways, outside, have other people ask. When I train this one in the preschools that I work in, we'll have the child sometimes will have something written on his shirt, on a card on his shirt, or the teacher who's accompanying him will have a little card that she'll hand to people that'll say, ask Bobby what his name is. So that we have multiple trials in multiple environments with multiple people asking. So it starts to generalize more. That's one of the ways you can program for generalization. So it has a tendency to inhibit natural interactions because kids tend to learn that, they don't have, a lot of these little guys don't have the idea that I have to do something to get something. So when you use discrete trial teaching, they learn very quickly to watch for that M&M and watch for that Skittle and watch at the table. This is why I do something, because she's got the Skittles and the M&Ms. So you see where it doesn't kind of get naturalized in the natural context. This is why I do something, because it makes her laugh, or she tickles me, or it makes me happy. So those kind of natural interactions that you can foster with some of the more naturalistic forms of ABA don't happen as easily with discrete trial type of therapy. So we have had this, like I said, has been the most extensively researched, I believe, still, evidence-based practice that we have, and what we know from the research is that kids can learn a huge variety of skills using discrete trial therapy. And again, I will put that curriculum in there so you can get an idea in your additional readings of some of the different things that you can learn with discrete trial therapy. Usually what you're working on are language and behavioral skills, the management of behavior problems and behavioral correction, looking at vocal output, verbal output, or even communication strategies like picture exchange communication is done through discrete trial type therapy. You can teach play skills using discrete trial therapy. Typically you're training them how to play with materials or how to use materials functionally as opposed to social play. This is not a great technique for that. What we know about the early intensive behavioral treatment, and that what they're referring to, sometimes you're going to see EIBT differently referred to than DTT, and what they're referring to there is the idea of intensive early intervention using discrete trial therapy. And the research has shown that you get the best outcomes when you do 30 hours or more. And again, keep in mind, we're talking 2 to 4 year olds with this. You get the best outcomes when you do 30 hours or more of discrete trial therapy and not the eclectic treatments, where you're doing a variety of different things. Here, again, it's focusing on the more intensive, more learning opportunities where you're asking again and again and again for those intensive things. I had an interesting situation recently where I needed to go to court with a parent who was in a custody battle with one of my students, and he is a student that as a 3 and 4 year old we did intensive discrete trial training with. ABA really in some discrete trial, but we probably did about 20 hours a week of this intensive intervention with him, and he did really, really well, and he was really emerging. In fact, he went from being a moderate to severe student with ASD to a mild moderate student with ASD who's going to be in general education next year with some support. So it was a really successful outcome. When we went into court, the other parent who was trying to get custody had taken him to a BCBA who specializes, of course, in discrete trial therapy and various forms of ABA, and that ABA therapist was recommending 30 to 40 hours a week of direct ABA. Well, at that point, the child is 6 going on 7, and he's already included in a general ed setting. So I had to argue the point that here's a student who does benefit widely from the strategies of applied behavioral analysis in a classroom setting, but to take him out and put him into the more structured, rigorous setting that he's already emerged from would be counterintuitive and counterproductive. So the research does show that the 30 hours plus per week is a more effective way than the eclectic strategies, but keep in mind that's for the early intensive behavioral treatment. So again, I'll refer you to some of your additional readings about some of the pitfalls that people fall into with discrete trial teaching. Here are some of the problems. You get people who have a variety of skill levels, and you'll find yourself stuck on phases with certain practitioners because they're doing things wrong. And as I said, one of the things that frequently happens is that inter-trial interval and the pacing, things like that, getting the child's attention appropriately before you ask the SD, really understanding the nuances of the reinforcement survey and what really reinforces this child, the ability to be fluid and flexible in your reinforcers. All of those things are things that, as I said, it's easy to teach. I can give you a script, but there are some things that really require skill, and the skill level of the practitioner is pretty significant for when you see some breakdown there. The appropriate amount of discrete trial therapy, again, when you're talking early intervention, the more the better. For 2 and 3 year olds, we like to see it pretty intense. They're saying between 25, the ABA research actually, discrete trial research actually says more than 30 to 40 hours is what which causes the most improvement. Keep in mind the curriculum that you're looking at, what skills you're going to teach, and again in your additional readings I will include a curriculum, a sample curriculum for you to take a peek at. And in terms of generalizing and naturalizing, one of the things we're going to talk about next week is the more naturalized forms of applied behavioral analysis and how those can kind of merge into the programming, and programming for generalization can be encouraged using some of the other ABA methodologies that are effective as well in moving away from the intensive structure of discrete trial therapy.